joining Elizabeth Carr to welcome her here to us to deliver this talk on the history of the Monroe County Birth Control League here in the 1930s in Rochester, New York. Elizabeth is a doctoral candidate at the University of Rochester and is currently taking a break from working on her dissertation to share a sneak preview with all of us on her work on birth control and women's history in Rochester. So please join me in welcoming Elizabeth Carr.
Hello. Thank you all for coming out today. So I thought that instead of focusing, just sort of giving a recap of my article for this presentation, I'd talk a bit more in depth about some of the women who actually ran the clinic and were board members and volunteers. So I want to start with the idea that something historians are always grappling with is the fact that our work, and by extension society's understanding of history, is deeply connected to what historic records we have in the present. So often what we know and can confidently argue about the past is dictated by what sources exist, what information they provide, and what material people thought was worthwhile to preserve. So while historians are grateful for the material we do have available, it can also be really frustrating when records that you know must have existed at one point didn't actually survive into the present day. Often one of two issues arise when it comes to sources. You either have too few or too many, and these each present their own issues. When the material you find is scarce or doesn't go in depth enough for your topic, you'll have to fill in the blanks. Often historians will tackle this problem by using other material to supplement what they found or by making inferences using what does exist. Obviously this isn't ideal, but especially when dealing with individuals or groups who left behind few records, a lack of material is often the reality. On the other hand, it can also be a challenge to have too much material. Historians have to take what they find and create a cohesive narrative thread with it, but when the sources you find are really thorough or detailed, it can be tough to do this. Inevitably, some tidbit of information that's really interesting by itself doesn't fit into your narrative anywhere. It has to be left behind. When I went to the University of Rochester archives to look at the materials they had in their Planned Parenthood of the Rochester-Syracuse region collection, I was presented with both of these situations. I was initially hoping to look at the patients who had visited the clinic, but found that there was basically no information about them. Compiled demographic records are basically all that's been preserved about these women, which is unsurprising given both medical privacy regulations and the fact that they were low-income individuals whose stories might not have been valued at the time, but it's still frustrating to not know what it was like to be a patient at the brand new birth control clinic. I can tell you from archival material that the Rochester Center treated 282 Protestant women, 292 Catholics, and 13 Jewish individuals in 1936, but I can't tell you their names, life stories, or how access to birth control affected their lives. On the other hand, the Planned Parenthood collection has a ton of information about the people who worked or volunteered for the clinic, served on its board, or otherwise worked towards its success. In the early 1970s, Midgie Baum and Florence King, who were early board members, wrote to former volunteers to ask for their reflections for a book of memories, yielding numerous handwritten and typed letters from affiliated individuals. Although it's unclear if the memory book ever actually got put together, the archival collection contains 28 letters written by affiliated individuals about their experiences. Many of these letters were multiple pages, included anecdotes about patients, and were filled with thoughts and emotions from those women about the work they were doing. When I read them for the first time, I was floored by the amount of detail these individuals included and how much their words provided insight about the clinic's operation and what it was like to be working to provide birth control access while faced with so much opposition. And although I really enjoyed reading these stories, I ultimately had to leave many of them out of my article and just focus on the ones that fit best with the themes I was exploring. While I regret there isn't more available from the perspective of individual patients, my goal for today is to share with you all some of the material from clinic volunteers and staff that I had to omit from my article. I hope that by doing so, you can also gain a deeper appreciation for the work these people were doing and how they viewed their role in the community. I also want to stress now and throughout my talk how important records of this kind are as a tool for understanding the past. Numerical data and generalized records are fantastic resources for understanding broader trends, but the human element that is so crucial for the study of history is often lost in these sorts of items. Before I consider the memory book recollections, though, I want to look more in depth first at another piece of writing that I referenced throughout my article and that I found incredibly valuable as a resource. This is From the Cradle, a 16-page booklet written by the first executive director of the clinic, Ruth H. Backus, in roughly 1964. As mentioned in the article, Ruth was a trained social worker who was hired to run the clinics part-time around its inception. She ultimately held the position for 20 years, from 1934 to 1954, and wrote From the Cradle roughly a decade later. And I don't know if you can really see because the projector is kind of washed out, but it's sort of a tight pamphlet, but the cover is handwritten and it's like red construction paper almost. I don't believe it was published anywhere officially. She just kind of wrote it for herself to write down her reflections. This work touches on the clinic's history, fundraising efforts, patients, opposition, volunteers, and more as she recounts 20 years of her life and career. Perhaps most insightful, though, is Ruth's personality and obvious pride in the work she and others were doing, which shows through clearly in her personal insights about the clinic. Ruth starts this pamphlet by acknowledging that it will be more personal to her experience than objective, but also that, quote, "those were happy days, full of memorable experiences, exciting adventures," end quote. Given the critical health service that Backus and others were providing, it feels sort of weird to think of that time as being happy for them as the overriding feeling, but as we'll explore later, she's not the only one who looks back fondly on her days working for the clinic. The first few pages discuss the impetus for creating the center and some of the decisions that were made during its formation by board members. Unfortunately, Ruth was not involved in these discussions, so this lacks much of the personal touch that makes the rest of the work so valuable. However, one of the most interesting parts in my mind is this recounting of Ruth's discussion of the multiple names the clinic had during its early years. Here she writes that, due to the fact that we had no license to operate a clinic, nor any hope of obtaining one, we wanted to avoid that word. Almost everyone wanted to avoid the controversial words birth control, since many persons in the community considered that an indecent subject. Mother's Health Center and Maternal Health Center were considered, then discarded. Both of these were too suggestive of a clinic in the eyes of our legal advisor, and also could easily be confused with other agencies. We started off with the innocuous name of Welfare Center, later changed to Maternal Welfare Center. This proved to be a poor choice because of confusion with the welfare department. Again, it seemed advisable to change. Maternal Consultation Center was someone's brainchild and served the purpose, although we had occasional telephone calls regarding the purchase of maternity clothes or asking us to recommend an obstetrician. And although this is just one paragraph in the work as a whole, the different variables that Ruth brings up here are recurring themes throughout From the Cradle, as well as in other recollections. The clinic board, staff, and volunteers had to regularly contend with New York state laws, federal laws, public controversy regarding birth control, similarity to other services, and more when making almost every decision, from their name to how they marketed their services and treated patients. This is also an example from a historical perspective of how useful documents such as From the Cradle and other personal reflections are to the historical record. Without Backus's recounting of the name shifts the clinic underwent, there's nothing in the official records to indicate why the names seemingly changed at random, and if or how these institutions with different names were actually connected to each other. Having this document not only provides insight into the external influences the clinic was contending with, but also helps to clarify seeming inconsistencies that exist in the official record. Moving away from the clinic's name, one of the most important topics discussed in From the Cradle is public perception to the clinic. Ruth addressed this when she wrote that the phrase birth control had to be avoided because many persons in the community considered that an indecent subject, but this phrase is only one of many considerations the clinic staff had to make. One of Ruth's earliest comments on public perception comes when discussing how she came to hold the position of director, with her writing that she was approached because of her, quote, qualifications included background in medical social work, and most important, 3 children. The children were to demonstrate the positive side of family planning, exclamation point. Although Ruth did have relevant experience and was, as she states, a firm believer in birth control, she clearly viewed the optics of her status as a wife and mother to be ultimately more important to taking the directorship than any occupational training she had. Whether or not this actually influenced community perceptions of the clinic is difficult to determine, but clearly both the board and Ruth herself were considering the community's response to the center from its earliest days and were actively trying to make choices that would avoid backlash. Gaining community endorsement for their work is another key way to minimize controversy. Ruth wrote in one section of her pamphlet about wanting to get approval from local physicians, stating that, quote, we did win medical support in the community. For by 1940, we were able to enroll 96 doctors as medical sponsors who were willing to have their names appear on our literature. This was quite an achievement, since some of the doctors who openly supported us had been read out at the pulpit. One Sunday, a list of these names was printed on a church calendar, a blacklist not to be patronized. The result? An influx of patients seeking advice, both at the center and in private offices of some of the physicians." End quote. Similarly to the name section, this recollection highlights information about the clinic that would not be clear from institutional records alone. Winning the support of doctors gave the center more legitimacy in the eyes of community members, but also invited backlash against those individuals as well as the clinic. Local church opposition is a topic I look at in depth in the article, but it's also a recurring theme in Bacchus and many other recollections. Importantly, though, the decision of a local church to publish a blacklist led to increased attendance at both the clinic and its medical supporters, suggesting this publication had the unintended effect of actually promoting these services to community members who silently agreed with their work. Having physicians on board with the clinic's work made them targets, but that support helped the clinic to maintain a good medical reputation, and by extension continue to help Rochesterians manage their fertility. And again, this is kind of washed out here, but this is a pamphlet I found in the archives for their 20th anniversary fundraising drive. And you can see in that middle back page, they have a list of clergy sponsors and a list of medical sponsors. So this would have been 1954 roughly, and it's 2 columns, which are hard to see. But at that point, they had gotten some support, and I think it's also notable that they were putting the clergy kind of right next to the medical staff and sort of highlighting both of them. Luckily for the clinic, however, not all perceptions about them were negative. Ruth recounts one incident in From the Cradle that speaks to the interest the public had in the center and its services. She wrote that shortly after moving to a new address in the late 1940s, bullet holes were found in a window one morning, and a police officer was sent to investigate. However, quote, "It was very difficult to get him to take even a cursory glance at the bullet holes because of his avid curiosity about what went on in the house. After a tour of the premises, including the medical department, and at least 2 hours of conversation regarding his and his friends' problems, his views on abortion, and his enthusiastic endorsement of our program, I finally got him around to the subject of the bullets." This experience of explaining the program happened over and over again with plumbers, carpenters, and electricians, until finally we fled when they arrived so that they could get their work done. End quote. Ruth unfortunately does not expand on why the clinic had bullet holes in their window, which to me seems like actually the really most important part of this. But this anecdote does serve to highlight the curiosity and interest some members of the public had about the goings-on there. It's not hard to imagine why people who were allowed to peek behind the curtain, so to speak, might have been so interested to hear about what happened at the clinic, especially given how outwardly negative some of the press about them was. This police officer might not have ever needed the services of the clinic, but his avid curiosity and enthusiastic endorsement of their program do suggest that Rochesterians of all types knew about the clinic and had some sort of opinion on it, even if it was just a desire to know more. You can almost imagine the officer, as well as the plumbers, carpenters, and electricians who came to the building, excitedly reporting back to their friends and coworkers on what the clinic and its staff were like, and how these tales might have informed others' opinions of their work. The clinic continued to establish its reputation in the city, and the topic of birth control became less taboo over the years, but not all public attitudes changed with it. Towards the end of From the Cradle, Ruth offered readers one final anecdote about the public response to their work. She recounts that their, quote, "mail was always full of pleasant surprises, fascinating letters from patients, home remedies which someone had found effective, anonymous letters often with biblical quotes and dire predictions about the hereafter," end quote. She included the text of one such letter she received upon her retirement from the clinic in 1954, which read, and for the record, she also stated it was printed on pale pink paper, which is why this slide looks different. I was trying to replicate that, and you can't really tell from the lighting, but that's fine. Okay. "Dear Mrs. Bacchus, I have just finished reading the morning paper in regards to the dinner in your honor. How very sorry I feel for you, for when you breathe your last, you will recall all the advice you have given in this awful Planned Parenthood. How can you face your maker and feel you did the right thing? Night after night, yes, and days are terrible when I think of my Planned Parenthood that I practiced. Would to God I had taken all the children he would have gladly sent me. What is marriage for anyway? I wish you no success in your work, but hope you can find peace of mind. Sincerely, Reader D&C." Ruth doesn't offer any of her opinions on the letter besides the fact that, quote, "it was a parting shot from another friend who wouldn't sign her name," which makes me think that she was pretty amused by it. You can also imagine if this was the kind of mail she was getting upon her retirement, what message she might have gotten while still actively working at the clinic. And although there's really no way to determine just from this letter or anecdote how popular the sentiments expressed in it were, it does stress how deeply controversial the work Backus and others engaged in was, and how passionate people on both sides of the debate over birth control could be about the issue. In many ways, though, this letter also demonstrates why publicity and public perception of the clinic was so important. Given that the center relied heavily on donations, keeping backlash such as this to a minimum and encouraging support or curiosity like the police officer had would have been critical to the clinic's continued operation and success in Rochester. Ruth also devotes part of her pamphlet to discussing the patients who visited the clinic. Although other recollections go more in depth about their experiences, as I'll show you later, the insights Ruth does offer suggest she felt great responsibility for these women and their hardships. Ruth first mentions patients when discussing the clinic's opening day and the people who were scheduled for appointments. She writes, quote, "I shall never forget the 4 patients. Not only did they have economic problems, but serious health ones as well. Otherwise, they could not have been accepted, as health reasons for giving contraceptive advice had to be written on the chart," end quote. She follows up on these women a page later when she states that, quote, "As I look back on those opening days, I realize how naive I was, thinking all you needed to do was lead a horse to water and he would drink. When the neediest of our first 4 patients failed to return for her checkup, it was a blow. I finally got so I could hold my head up and not duck into corners when I met my agency friends, who couldn't wait to tell me that Mrs. S., whom they had sent to the center, was now pregnant with her 9th, end quote. The way she discusses these cases suggests that Ruth felt great responsibility for these women and their well-being, and struggled with the idea that the clinic's services did not always provide meaningful change for their clientele. Other recollections discuss both successes and failures when it comes to patients, but Ruth felt compelled to mainly speak about the cases she had regrets about. Later in the pamphlet, she writes of several patients she had to refuse due to the women not being married at the time. Although she notes the refusal was due to the need for public support and to avoid legal challenges, she states, quote, that, quote, "It fell to my lot to turn away 2 or 3 applicants whom I've never forgotten because my heart was not in it," end quote. One she recounts was a mother of 9 whose husband had recently been murdered and was denied contraception because she was no longer married. Another was a woman who had 2 children but was not married and was therefore denied services for the same reason. Ruth writes that in the second case that, quote, "When several months later she jumped off the Veterans Bridge, I wondered if I'd given her a little push," end quote. Combined with her statement that, quote, "I think I regret most the refusal of our help on moral grounds," end quote, it's clear that the weight of these rejections and the personal ramifications they had on these women's lives weighed heavily on Ruth, even decades after her encounters with them. Like much of the material in From the Cradle, this suggests an emotional dimension to clinic work that is not reflected in institutional records and only becomes clear when you learn about it from those who are actually involved in its functioning. Unfortunately, these types of reflections are also the only spaces where we get to actually hear about the individual women who visited the clinic for its services, meaning their stories and experiences are filtered through the lens of those who are operating it, and which cases have, for one reason or another, stood out to them the most over the years. The final dimension of Ruth's reflections that I want to look at today are those that involve other clinic staff and volunteers. As she writes at one point, quote, "While they are still a most important part of Planned Parenthood today, they were absolutely vital in our early days," end quote. The respect and goodwill workers at the clinic had for each other is clear across a variety of reflections, but Ruth continually peppers her anecdotes with statements about how incredible these individuals were. The second paragraph of the pamphlet states that she, quote, "is well aware of all the others to whom we should be eternally grateful for our success," end quote, while elsewhere she states that, quote, "many volunteers subsequently became board members with an invaluable background of understanding the programs," end quote. And indeed, the board itself she refers to as outstanding, with, quote, "a succession of truly marvelous presidents who never cease to amaze and thrill me," end quote. Not only were other workers capable and dedicated, but Ruth also seemed to have found real value in the job as well as other staff and their friendships. The pamphlet's closing lines suggest the fulfillment she found in her work at the clinic. Quote, "In thinking back over all these years, I can only say that there has been nothing to cover up or be ashamed of, only a great sense of pride that I was fortunate enough to have a small part in this venture. I will always cherish the excitement, the sense of high endeavor, the the real accomplishments and the priceless friendships." Quote. Of course, the goal of the clinic was not for the staff and volunteers to make friends, but rather to provide essential health services to those who could otherwise not afford them. We have the institutional records that confirm this did happen, so using Ruth and other workers' memoirs to fill in the human element of the clinic work is essential to getting a full picture of what the clinic was like during its earliest days. As I hope I've made clear from this looking at from the cradle, this piece is a wide-ranging and invaluable resource for the Planned Parenthood collection as a whole. While I could not talk about every part of it individually, I hope this sampling of stories from its pages makes clear some of the issues the staff and clinic volunteers had to contend with, and what they thought about the work they were doing, and what they saw their community role as being. Now, though, I want to transition to look at some of the reflections other individuals wrote about their time at the clinic and the themes that are repeated there. As Ruth wrote, "No one ever leaves Planned Parenthood for good. It is a way of life," a sentiment that seems to be shared by many who volunteered at or otherwise worked for the clinic at some point. Board member Midgie Baum wrote in 1973 that she accepted her board position, quote, "with enthusiasm, but with no idea that this would become a consuming life interest," end quote. Later in her reminiscences, she states that, quote, "each board member became more and more involved so that birth control became a part of the bloodstream of each board member. This meant that they were hooked for life and grateful for it," end quote. Baum was telling the truth here. She was involved in birth control advocacy at the local, state, and federal levels for over 50 years. However, she was not the only one who got birth control in her bloodstream, so to speak. Helen Rogers, who served as the clinic librarian for many years, wrote in 1973 that, quote, "I joined the board as a young mother and felt it to be the most important community service I could do," end quote. Although she eventually left Rochester, Helen noted that, quote, "my interest has continued through all these years, and I have found myself involved in every city we have lived in: Columbus, Ohio, Chicago, and now San Diego," end quote. More than just being involved in these places, though, Helen even includes the fact that she helped establish the San Diego clinic when she moved there in the 1960s. Clearly, her work in Rochester was not only the most important community service she could do, but the start of a lifelong commitment to birth control access that led to her affecting change throughout the country. And although it's incredible to think of Helen's work across the U.S., she was not the only member of the Rochester Clinic who got involved in birth control advocacy on a larger scale. While many people stayed in Rochester and did most of their work here, they also traveled to visit other clinics, attend conferences, and help promote birth control in other areas. One of the first clinic doctors, Saul Morris, recounted that in 1935, he, Ruth Backus, and another staffer named Alma Jardine went to Cleveland, Ohio to visit the city's birth control clinic and, quote, "were able to compare our methods with theirs," end quote. He also wrote that he, quote, "was fortunate shortly afterwards to observe the clinic and meet Margaret Sanger in New York," end quote. Morris doesn't expand on the exact purpose of these visits, but given that Rochester opened its doors in 1934, it's reasonable to think of these observations were intended to help staffers figure out how to help best manage the Rochester Center by seeing how others were doing so. Besides making visits, Rochesterians were also involved in advocacy at a national level. Marcia Ellingson remembered that she, quote, "wrote letters to our good friends in Congress, the Honorable Judy Weiss and Senator Kenneth Keating, who were trying to get a statement on world population from the White House," end quote. Articles and flyers in the archival collection also suggest that individuals traveled to attend conferences or meetings. For example, Ruth Backus spoke during a series of birth control sessions at the National Conference for Social Work in 1939, while a group of 6 attended the annual meeting of the American Birth Control League in New York City that same year. This sampling of records demonstrates that while much of the focus for volunteers was on their own city, they were also willing to advocate for birth control at a larger scale, or to use their own experiences in Rochester to comment on broader issues. Finally, Rochester Clinic members recounted not just aiding those who live specifically within city limits, but those in the surrounding areas as well. Staff member Louise Wendt wrote in her reflections that, quote, "volunteers carried their know-how and enthusiasm for the program to smaller communities in Western New York where there was as yet no birth control service," end quote. She mentions trips they took to Corning, Auburn, Geneva, Jamestown, and Canandaigua, as well as collaboration with clinics in Buffalo and Syracuse. Wendt describes their efforts as ranging from consulting and sharing experiences with people who were interested in forming their own clinics, to speaking with physicians who might have worked at a clinic or provide birth control, and to dispensing contraceptives after patients had seen a doctor. Wendt's entire reflection paints a picture of a network of volunteers working to provide birth control, not just to their own community, but to the surrounding one as well, and highlights how Rochester Clinic members were part of a larger movement focused on providing and promoting birth control. To do this work, however, it was necessary to engage in fundraising efforts. Records suggest that the clinic would have several fundraising events throughout the year, as well as solicit donations at other times. Ruth Briggs mentioned in her recollections that in 1936, the board of directors hosted an annual fundraising dinner at the Hotel Seneca Ballroom with a goal of either $3,000 or $4,000, which is somewhere between $68,500 and $91,300 in today's money. It's not exactly clear from her recollections if they met their goal, but clinic fundraisers had a tendency to attract big names. Marcia Ellingson recounted some of these, writing that they included, quote, Dr. Abraham Stone in 1954, Lady Rama Rao's entertainment at the Harper Sibley home in 1953, Margaret Sanger's reception at our home on May 28, 1956, and 25 bouquets of lily of the valley in a small hall of the Chamber of Commerce, making the room fragrant as centerpieces for each table to welcome Dr. Ellen Guttmacher's appearance on our 25th anniversary, end quote. I'm not really sure why she felt compelled to include the flowers, but good to know, I guess. Although not many of these names are well known today, they were all important figures in the promotion of birth control practices at the time. And in some ways, it's impressive that Rochester was able to get such big names to the city for fundraising efforts. Marcia also speaks in her recollections about how much she enjoys working with other board members on fundraising, a sentiment that others seem to share. As Helen Rogers wrote, quote, another memory I have is of the fun and cooperation we had in raising money for Planned Parenthood. The system patterned after the community fund drive was carried out with great dispatch, with daily reports at noon and a final banquet to add up the totals. It was a very vital group of women who were a joy to know and work with, end quote. Like many other elements of operating the clinic, however, people seem to find enjoyment in their labor and community. Other times, though, fundraising was more tedious than it was fun. Midgie Baum, for one, seemed to find the process of soliciting donations frustrating. In her recollections, my God, she wrote that, quote, I recall vividly making appointments and going to the offices of businessmen in our community. I was often not invited into their offices, and on one occasion I stood in the doorway while the man sat at his desk and signing checks. He said, you can talk to me, and I can listen and sign these checks at the same time. Take my word for it, this makes for very difficult fundraising, end quote. Very likely, these reactions were due to the reputation the clinic and birth control more generally had during this time, and the hesitation of certain individuals to associate with such a cause. Although Ruth Backus spoke repeatedly of the clinic's struggle to maintain a good public image in From the Cradle, she was by no means the only person to comment on this. Marcia Ellingson reported that while running publicity for the clinic, she was instructed to, quote, tread lightly on public resistance to words like birth control and contraceptives. We emphasized phrases like every child a wanted child, end quote. Irene Scott, who also did publicity for the clinic, ran into issues with how to market its services as well. Irene wrote that after working with statistical records, she wrote a promotional pamphlet that incorporated stories of actual cases. When she ran it by the clinic's lawyer, however, the reception was less than stellar. Quote, I sat with bated breath awaiting his suggestions. The verdict finally came. Mrs. Scott, I disagree with your little pamphlet in toto. Exit Mrs. S, completely crushed, end quote. Irene did eventually figure out how to get information out to the public, but even this was not ideal. As she wrote, quote, the newspapers gave us willing publicity on the social page, where we usually tried to have a picture of some prominent member of our board, hopefully surrounded by her own children, but the civic pages would print none of our news, even when distinguished people came as speakers at our annual meetings, end quote. I was actually really excited when I read this quote and then realized the photo I had from the archival records of a newspaper clipping is of Irene with her children. I was very glad they saved that one, and maybe that's what the quote, I don't know. This anecdote, though, reflects Ruth Backus's assertion that her most important qualification as director was being a mother, but it also highlights how these individuals might have leveraged their class standing to promote the cause of birth control. Although the society pages were not as good a fit for their work as the civic section would have been, the fact that they had members prominent enough to earn a place in the society pages allowed the clinic to get at least some publicity from newspapers. Other volunteers were even more creative in the strategies they employed to get the word out. Lucia Valentine, who was married to the president of the University of Rochester, wrote that she remembered, quote, money raising with Midgie Baum in the opulent Eastman House Lincoln with the disapproving chauffeur at the wheel. We combed the streets. We called on all the druggists and urged them to tell their customers of the clinic, end quote. While these literal drives hopefully got some money and patients to the clinic, it was by no means the only creative method used to get donations. Several individuals, including Ruth Backus, wrote in their recollections about a series of skits that Florence King developed that were intended to show the plight of their patients. According to King, these skits were made of an amalgamation of different patient experiences, but, quote, met with enthusiastic success, not because we were so good, but because they told the real personal and intimate story of a life problem experienced by everyone, end quote. King recounts in particular 2 times these skits were performed at the house of wealthy Rochesterians, and how audience members were so convinced by them they tried to give Florence money and clothing, believing her to be an actual patient. Unfortunately, we don't have the content of these skits, but despite there may be questionable ethics in impersonating patients, they seem at least to have been effective at generating emotional responses and financial support for the work the clinic was doing. Another more creative endeavor was a jingle that Marjorie Reynolds wrote during a Planned Parenthood drive, which was called Fertile Myrtle. Her recollections only say that she suspects it would be unsuitable for a book of memories, so it's not clear if she wrote this just for herself or if it was performed at a drive for prospective donors, but she doesn't hold back in it. I guess I can do a dramatic reading of Fertile Myrtle. Okay. Oh, sir, you're very handsome, and what have I to fear? I'd love to have a bit of fun and be your little dear. Oh, yes, I'm quite prepared to go as far as you would like. I know a lovely secret, so the payoff will not strike. You asked me, did I buy it in a shop for drugs and gum? I wouldn't be so wicked. I wouldn't be so dumb. We go to church each Sunday. Father Kelly gave my ma a little book. He said that it would make things nice for Pa. I read it all last Tuesday, and the state's quite safe, I find. So let's strike up the rhythm. May joy be unconfined. Alas, 9 months from Tuesday, when Myrtle is 16, 3 lace-trimmed bassinets in Myrtle's room are seen. They each belong to someone, and each one has a name. Bastard, bastard, bastard. They all are named the same. So if you must be silly, to me it really looks as if the church's marriage laws are safer than its books. There's a lot to unpack here. I kind of hate the implication that Myrtle's main trait is being fertile. Yeah, a lot to unpack. I do kind of like the bastard, bastard, bastard line though. And obviously this jingle shows a more human and less polished version of these women. And I'm really curious to know if Marjorie actually performed this for donors, and if so, what their reaction was. But even without that knowledge, Fertile Myrtle includes the same sort of storytelling and creativity of Florence King's skits, only this time with a specific target in mind. And interestingly, even though this piece is about Myrtle, it ends up being more a condemnation of the church and the subpar contraceptive methods that it offered parishioners, a theme that's the main focus of Marjorie's 5-page letter on her experiences. I cover church opposition more in depth in my article, so here I'd just like to focus on some of the anecdotes these women offered about the frustrations they felt with the church and their position on birth control. Starting with Marjorie, she recounted in a series of tales of specific patients who struggled to reconcile their religious beliefs with their desire for birth control, including one who was instructed by her priest to cut up the new diaphragm and flush it down the toilet. Another she describes as braver and, quote, told me she could not receive communion or absolution and risked her immortal soul by using birth control, end quote. Marjorie also recalls a meeting she had with the local priest about his opposition to the clinic, in which he, quote, implied that my husband had died because of his wickedness in being associated with this plan to circumvent God's will, and he said to me, quote, as a man, I would not sit down at a table and eat a meal with you. As a priest, I pity you, end quote. Marjorie's husband, it should be noted, was the first treasurer of the clinic and died suddenly in 1936, an example of men participating in the cause locally, but surely the priest's comments were a slap in the face to the grieving widow. Other priests also made disparaging comments about birth control advocates and their families. Lucia Valentine recalled that her husband Alan, who was at the time the president of U of R, quote, was pulled in to help and probably made speeches. In any case, he was the Antichrist in the Catholic bishop's Easter sermon one year, end quote. While Alan's involvement in the cause seems to have been minimal compared to that of his wife, he was still the one critiqued in a public forum by a prominent religious leader, by extension, a condemnation of the work all birth control advocates in the city were doing. Besides interfering with individuals' ability to receive services, the church in Rochester also impacted the clinic's functioning. Marcia Ellingson recounted that the clinic's bid to join the Council of Social Agencies, which would have given them access to community funding, was vigorously opposed by the Catholic Church. According to Marcia, quote, "After one priest told Howard Cumming that if we got into the council, they would tear the organization apart, I declared in meeting that we ought to call a spade and a Catholic a Catholic. The statement I drew up was toned down. Wiser counsel prevailed." End quote. Church opposition not only affected Catholic women, but threatened to hurt the entire organization's stability. Church pushback, however, was not the only pressure the clinic faced. Many recollections mention struggling to convince medical practitioners to support the organization, some because they lacked the knowledge of birth control practices, and others because they were concerned about sullying their professional reputations by getting involved in such a controversial cause. Florence King captured this dynamic well when discussing attempts to set up a referral service, writing that, quote, "Topics related to sex and procreation weren't quite nice. Many doctors feared to have their names appear on a list as being willing to give good birth control advice. And alas, many were not well informed and so busy with a heavy patient load they had no time to learn. Tell Johnny to sleep on the roof was the answer to many concerned and anxious women." End quote. With these two dynamics at play, it's no wonder that people have so many recollections about what the broader medical community in Rochester thought about the clinic. Medical support for the clinic was particularly important because of the fine line the clinic tread often between medical advice, offering medical advice, obeying prohibitive laws, and trying to treat people who otherwise lacked health resources such as a regular physician. Board member Catherine Whipple noted that it was not just money or support the clinic desired from physicians, it was also their expertise. Quote, "The prejudice was so strong that many doctors refused or hesitated to lend their names or services to the cause, for fear it would affect their practice. However, we and others persisted in our efforts," end quote. Ruth Briggs noted a similar dynamic, writing that, quote, "Very few doctors at the time would contribute to our campaign or help us in any way. Most of them did not approve of our organization. If they did, they had not the courage to admit it," end quote. The clinic did have several physicians on staff or on the board from its inception, but widespread support from the medical community was certainly another obstacle they faced. As with simple ignorance, Marjorie Reynolds started her recollection by saying that the physician who delivered her first child in 1932 refused to fit her with a diaphragm, stating that, quote, "It would be like selling bootleg liquor in Prohibition days," end quote. Dr. Quigley had not caught up with the court ruling, and such was his attitude. Luckily for Marjorie and thousands of other Rochesterians, the clinic was able to provide them assistance in obtaining birth control. After this instance with her obstetrician, Marjorie quotes her husband as telling her to, quote, "Go to Mrs. Backus. She will help you," end quote. Given the patient records that are available, it seems that hundreds of women not only got this advice through the 1930s and 1940s, but were able to get access to the services they desired. What I've shared with you all today is just a sampling of the stories that the Planned Parenthood collection contains. To actually sit here and read each letter or Olive from the Cradle would take hours. But contained in these works are stories that give great insight into these women's experiences and emotions as they engaged in work they knew was controversial, but also felt was deeply important. Almost as incredible as these reminiscences, however, are the fact that they were written decades after the events described in them. Ruth Backus wrote from the Cradle 30 years after the clinic opened, while the other recollections were collected around the clinic's 40th anniversary in the 1970s. Yet the events and stories described in them are so vivid. It's clear that these women were deeply impacted by the patients, community, and other individuals they interacted with during their time at the clinic. Equally impressive is the fact that we even have these records to begin with. If Midgie and Florence hadn't decided to put together a book of memories, or if Ruth hadn't decided to write in depth about her experience, we'd have no way of knowing any of the information I've shared with you all today. And this information isn't just interesting. It's vital for understanding what it was like for these women to be a part of the birth control movement during its early days, how the clinic was established, and how they worked to grow it. Meeting minutes or other official records could fill in some of these gaps, but they don't capture the human experience the way personal reflections or stories do. I think that often the concept of record keeping, or even the term records, feels really official and data driven and out of reach for most people. Keeping a diary or writing down your experiences doesn't feel as official as something like census statistics, but often these human-centered resources are the most valuable for historians. History is ultimately about people and their lives, and part of my own personal approach to the study of history is that people's stories, and especially those of ordinary people, need to be centered in any telling of the past. Allowing people to speak for themselves and their own experiences is one of the most valuable ways we can learn about the past. And I hope by sharing some of these women's stories with you today in their own words, I've helped you to gain a better understanding of this piece of Rochester history. Thank you. I'm not 100% certain on that. I know somebody in one of their recollections says that they sent a bunch of material to the city historian. So I'm guessing at some point it transferred from the city to U of R. Probably the finding aid online would list when it was donated. And I think at some point Rochester and Syracuse Planned Parenthoods kind of merged organizationally. So
About 2010.
okay, so maybe that's when they got transferred.
I know they needed space, and I don't know if many were still there, or how many were, at that office. Is there still a library, or is there any records at the clinic itself?
Not as far as I know. I think most of what still exists from this time period is in the archives at U of R. My guess is the finding aid would have the specific year and what's the word I want, the provenance of these records, but off the top of my head, I don't.
Where are they housed? In the medical library?
No, they're at the Rare Books and Special Collections Department, and I was going to include in here and kind of forgot that that department is open to anybody who wants to go in and do research. You just have to make an appointment. And if you're interested in this, I really would encourage you to go read these recollections because they're really interesting, and I could not include everything these women had to say about their experiences.
They have a yearly award, it's the Nikki Baum Award.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, fun.
It's given to, people that are exemplary and serving the agency.
Yeah, she definitely was. I found newspaper articles saying that she had worked for 50 years for the Planned Parenthood here and was also advocating at different levels. She had a profile when she was like 90 of her, this like little tiny old woman sitting there and looking so happy. Mhm.
Are there other questions?
Besides diaphragms and I imagine condoms,
Mhm.
did they have, before the birth control pill in 1973, I guess?
Can you please, I'm sorry. Can you please repeat that question before you answer?
Oh, sure.
For our home audience, too.
I'm just wondering what else they offered besides, rhythm method, diaphragm, and condoms at that time. Was there anything else
Mhm.
they particularly offered?
Yeah, so the question is what kinds of birth control they offered. And this is something I sort of discuss in the article as well because they were in some ways following national trends in this regard, in some ways breaking with them. They mainly offered diaphragms. It's something like 95 to 98% of patients were given diaphragms in either spermicidal jelly or foam. Some of them were given cervical caps. I think some were given condoms. Very, very few were recommended, like rhythm method. But it's really interesting because diaphragms are a really expensive form of birth control. So a lot of birth control clinics nationally recognize that as being the most effective, but we're also kind of hesitant to give them out because they were so pricey to actually get. And they required a lot more upfront labor because you have to measure the woman's cervix in order to fit a diaphragm correctly. So it's really interesting, actually, that this clinic was willing to sort of spend that kind of money on women who couldn't pay a fee or were getting these materials for free, when other clinics were not as willing to do so just because of their cost.
I was wondering who fitted them. Did they have medical personnel?
Yeah, so they had medical personnel on staff. I think usually it was like 2-ish doctors in the early days, and I believe they worked there part-time and probably had their own practice. There's this kind of awful, kind of funny story that's repeated in a few recollections, that at their first clinic they didn't have an actual examining table, so they had to use a pool table, which is kind of horrible to think about, but also, I guess, make do with what you have. Yeah, so women would come in and be fitted by a medical doctor, and that was also part of fitting with the laws at the time, was you had to have a medical professional and like a health reason to give advice and contraceptives.
One more question. When did they become part of the Planned Parenthood Federation?
In the 1950s, I believe. Yeah, so up until then, they were kind of their own independent organization, and then later merged with, it was the American League for Birth Control, which became Planned Parenthood.
So I was wondering, I know you said that you discussed the kind of church opposition more fully in your article, but how organized was that church opposition? Was it the Catholic Church in Rochester writ large? Were there some kind of like individuals who were more active in that opposition, at least from what you can tell from the recollections?
Yeah, so my understanding is that it's more individualized. However, that anecdote about the bishop making specific comments about this one advocate being the Antichrist makes me think that there was some kind of organized opposition. And also the recollection about them being blocked from from community funding and access to that board that I can't remember the name of now. Makes me think there might have been some kind of organization, but I think a lot of it was just individual priests or pastors kind of condemning it in sermons or publishing their own materials about why you shouldn't go. There is, I think there's a photo of it in the article somewhere, but there's an anecdote about how the Catholic Courier, which was a local Catholic paper, published a full headline front page about, I think the byline is like race suicide drive starts today or something, and the entire front page was just articles about birth control and why it's so bad. And the anecdote from one of the clinic doctors actually is that a bunch of women saw that and then went, oh cool, there's a birth control clinic, and ended up going. So kind of backfired on them a little bit. But I think, yeah, I guess both. I think it was individuals, but also there was some sort of organization if you have the local paper and the bishop speaking about it. Uh-oh.
As a newspaper, in case people didn't know that, and most recently their political shot at these kind of issues was into this current election, because the Catholic Courier published an article coming out strongly against Proposition 1. So
Interesting.
they're still had their hand in it.
Yeah, hopefully no race suicide drive starts here anymore. Yeah.
Still like there's like that.
Yeah, I know.
But Rochester also has a coalition of clergy for reproductive rights. It's quite expansive and it's ecumenical, so there has been an ecumenical backlash to some of the anti-reproductive rights voices.
Yeah, and it seems like getting religious support for the clinic was really important, even from the earliest days. Let's see if I can find it. That one pamphlet that's really washed out that has like the list of clergy sponsors and medical sponsors. If you're able to read the board member names, there's, I believe, 1 reverend and 3 or 4 doctors on the staff. So I think kind of having those like community leaders in with them. Kind of, they were trying to do a lot of, okay, we have a reverend on the staff, that might make religious individuals feel more comfortable about coming to the clinic.